We all know them. The illustrations in our history books showing us legions of ancient Egyptian laborers constructing the monumental pyramids with nothing but ropes, ramps, and sheer muscle power. But what if this widespread notion is simply wrong? What if the pharaohs didn't just have simple tools like hammers and chisels, but a lost, advanced technology that we wouldn't even dare to dream of today? Well, then we would have arrived at the heart of the heated debate that has been going on in the alternative scene for several decades now. But what evidence is there that the ancient Egyptians were in fact far more advanced than is commonly assumed? And could it really be that this knowledge is deliberately hidden from us? How much does a single family home weigh? A quick Google search shows that the home sweet home weighs an average of 250 to 300 tons. Or the equivalent of around 3.6 to 4.3 rosy granite blocks. After all, there is one thing we must not forget. When the ancient Egyptians built the so-called King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid, they had to maneuver colossal blocks of rose granite weighing up to 70 tons each to dizzying heights. The question of how the inhabitants of ancient times managed to move such extreme loads without the help of modern machines, and then to fit them perfectly, is still one of the most controversial historical puzzles of our time. What is undisputed, however, is that the architectural megalomania of the inhabitants of the Pharaonic Empire knew no bounds. After all, the Great Pyramid, which consists of around 2.65 million stone blocks, was the tallest structure in the world for almost 4,000 years. But, if you like, the historical mystery begins even before the ancient construction site. The material, which weighed tons, actually had to be dragged from quarries up to 800 kilometers from the Giza Plateau. And yet, despite the gigantic blocks and the lack of pyramid construction records, the Egyptians somehow managed to build a 147-meter-high giant out of the ground, which, in addition to its monumental dimensions, also boasts an almost ridiculously high level of precision. You may have heard that the blocks of the pyramids fit together so perfectly that not even a sheet of paper would fit between them, that their sides are aligned exactly with the 4 cardinal points, and that the difference in the lengths of the sides is not even 1/1000th of a meter. And although the Pyramid of Cheops is undoubtedly the most famous stone testimony to the Egyptians and is still overshadowed by huge questions, it is by no means the only one. Just take a look at the Valley Temple of the King Shepharon, located near the Great Sphinx. Many of the rose granite blocks at this site weigh more than 30 tons. Nevertheless, the massive individual parts were put together so perfectly that they look like an oversized puzzle. In front of the impressive blocks, even adults look like puny kids. And once again, the material used came not from a quarry around the corner, but from several hundred kilometers away. Does this mishap prove the existence of a lost technology? When it comes to the question of how the ancient Egyptians moved their enormous loads from A to B, conservative historians usually point to ships. This is an understandable approach, but it does have a small archaeological catch. Even the largest Egyptian ships that have been awakened from their historical slumber so far would never have been able to withstand such immense weights. What the current historiography also cannot withstand is the hypothesis that the Egyptians by no means used hammers and soft copper chisels to process their stone blocks, but a futuristic laser cutting technology. And in fact, the proof of this wacky thesis is said to be visible for everyone in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Specifically, this refers to a block adorned with a strangely oblique cut, and which is consequently a stone that was damaged and could no longer be used. However, the length of the cut can quickly make you wonder, why would the ancient stonemason have continued working for hours or even days if the block was no longer usable? Historians generally assume that the inhabitants of the Pharaonic kingdom used a combination of copper saws and a mixture of water, plaster, and quartz sand to cut the stone. And indeed, the presumed construction techniques were to be subjected to a few modern practical tests, and the results were quite sobering. In one of these cases, 2 men were struggling with a simple saw on a typical block of stone, and managed to penetrate just 4 millimeters into the material in an hour. So how long would the Egyptians have had to keep sawing before they realized they had made the cut on the museum block? For many an alternative-minded person, the displayed mishap testifies to nothing more than the solid proof that something may be wrong with our current ideas. In other words, the techniques of the Egyptians were never as simple as officially taught. On the contrary, they had exceptionally effective technologies that allowed them to work with the massive components at will and at lightning speed. Ancient Egyptian helicopters and battle tanks. It is said that the ancient Egyptians themselves immortalized their extraordinary technological achievements for posterity, but unfortunately we have forgotten how to interpret the records of the past correctly. Among the most famous motifs that are said to attest to this controversial fact are the so-called bulbs of Dendera. And while the corresponding reliefs adorn the eponymous Temple of Hathor at Dendera, they divide the public into two camps. The conservative researchers say that here we see only the Egyptian creation myth. The alternative side, however, does not recognize the bubble-shaped containers as the womb of the sky goddess Nut, but as fully functional electric lamps. The matter is no less controversial in the case of the enigmatic hieroglyphics that catch our eye in the mortuary temple of Sethos I in Abydos. After all, we see here extremely strange shapes that resemble airplanes and helicopters. But how is that possible? How could the ancient Egyptians even know what such technologies look like or how they work? But that's not all. A battle tank and a submarine are also said to have crept into the Abydos hieroglyphics. Well, at least that's the conclusion reached by the Ancient Astronaut Society group, which discovered the symbols in the middle of the so-called Appearance Hall in the 1990s. The team interpreted the images as incontrovertible proof of the pre-astronaut theory. That is, the assumption that the Egyptians were in regular contact with extraterrestrial intelligences. While they were worshipped as divine beings from then on, they revealed advanced knowledge to the inhabitants of the earth in return, which made the construction of the pyramids and the like possible in the first place. But it is not really surprising that the long-established Egyptologists interpret the Abydos hieroglyphics a little differently. According to them, the inscription originally mentioned the so-called Nebti and throne names of Pharaoh Sethi I. The translation was as follows: the Nebti name, born again with a mighty sword, he who destroys the 9 bows. And the throne name, king of Upper and Lower Egypt, lord of the 2 lands, the world order of Re is enduring. Later, parts of the inscription were covered with plaster and replaced with the names of Ramses II. However, as the bright colors faded over time and the plaster crumbled from the stone, the older hieroglyphs reappeared. So what looks like a modern helicopter is actually a combination of the original sign for bow and the later hieroglyphics for striking arm, quail chick, and arm. The supposed battle tank comes from the hieroglyphic mixture of hand and half. The submarine is actually a mixture of arm and basket. On the trail of lost technologies. But then, of course, there is also the legend of the Hall of Records. Under the Sphinx's paws is said to be a secret door leading straight to an ancient library that testifies to the existence of a long-forgotten pre-Egyptian civilization. The fact that the Sphinx is significantly older than generally assumed is supposedly shown by conspicuous water erosion marks that simply do not match the climate records of the last 5,000 years. To explain these, and also to obtain a suitable match with the belt stars of Orion, one would have to turn back the wheel of time as far as 10,500 BC. The pyramids, which were added later, are therefore architectural additions. They were aligned to coincide with the buildings from the so-called mythical time of the beginning. The ominous precursor culture that created the Sphinx is therefore said to have had a direct influence on the ancient Egyptians. And the technological masterpieces that arose from this traditional knowledge are said to have paved the way for the construction of the monumental buildings in the first place. But even if we simply embrace the idea that the ancient Egyptians had exotic technologies at their disposal, the question arises as to what these actually looked like in detail. Well, even the skeptical alternative camp is not in agreement on this point, but there is at least a consensus that they worked quite differently than our modern machines. For this reason, archaeologists would all be too happy to overlook them, because they are looking for something that resembles our inventions and completely ignore the idea that they could have been very different technologies back then. For example, some ancient Egyptian traditions tell of priests singing while the massive blocks were raised. Given the appropriate interpretation, it is therefore conceivable that the Egyptians had a sound-based technology. After all, we know that sound can fundamentally manipulate matter. And did you know that your click can manipulate the subscribe button? Press the thumbs up and subscribe now to never miss a video from us again. See you soon!